What is up, everybody? It is me, DevilNeverCry, and we are back with another video on NieR Replicant, this time going over some of the basics of the combat system. It became quite apparent yesterday while streaming NieR that it didn't really do all too good a job of explaining some of these combat mechanics, so that's what this video is for. Before we begin, I do want to say a quick thank you to Square Enix for providing me with a copy of the game. With that said, let's get into it. So starting off with the absolute basics, you've got two melee attacks at your disposal. You've got the light melee attack and the heavy melee attack, mapped to square and triangle or X and Y respectively. These are your bread and butter for close encounters. You can intermingle these button presses for whatever combo you wish to use. It's not a dial-up system, so you're not going to have to put in a specific input to get a specific combo. They're kind of separate. Each button press does its own thing, and it's up to you to figure out what kind of combo you want to use. These melee attacks can be charged, and they can be used mid-air. If you want to get enemies mid-air, there is an actual launcher the game decides not to tell you about for some reason. But this is simply done similar to Automata, where you press the jump button and then immediately after you press the heavy melee attack button and you'll launch the enemy. You'll follow them up in the air and you'll be able to sort of combo them stylishly with whatever you want in mid-air. Just something that people have not picked up on, which is a bit surprising. But then again, the game doesn't really tell you it's a thing, so who can blame them? Moving on, I want to briefly touch upon guard breaks. Now, the charge attacks in themselves are pretty cool because you charge them up, there's a cool animation, and they do a good chunk of damage. But they also serve a higher purpose, specifically with the higher tier of enemies. These enemies more often than not will come with a shield and they'll block your standard attacks. So what you want to do is you want to hit them with a charged attack to break their guard. Some enemies will be so tough that they can only be guard broke with a charged heavy melee attack, so do keep that in mind if you're wondering why your attacks just seem to be bouncing off an enemy's shield. This is something the game does touch upon eventually, but it's nice to know before this tutorial decides to pop up. Moving on, let's talk about attack cancelling. One of the good things about NieR Replicant's combat system is the fact that you can cancel out of a lot of your moves, allowing you to be very non-committal. If you're attacking a specific group of shades, for example, and you see some others sneaking up behind you, waiting to bamboozle you with their weapons, you can simply cancel out of your attack and get out of harm's way. There's different ways to go about doing this. You can simply dodge mid-attack animation, you can guard, or you can jump. All of these will have animation priority, I guess, over your attacks, allowing you to cancel them and get out of harm's way. On the topic of getting out of harm's way, that brings us to our next combat mechanic, and that is sidestepping. As the name implies, it allows you to sidestep enemy attacks, or just enemies in general, putting yourself in a more advantageous position. Looking at the footage here, you can see the protagonist doing a big wide semicircle arc, putting himself behind the enemy. And depending on which angle you sidestep an enemy to, you can end up in front of them or to the side of them, so be careful, because you can actually end up sidestepping into an enemy's attack, and that is not what you want. Now, to actually do a sidestep, all you have to do is lock on to an enemy and then simply dodge towards them. Now, the issue with this is that sometimes the detection can be a bit finicky, and more often than not you won't sidestep and you'll end up just jumping or dodging, into an enemy, which is not what you want, because if you're sidestepping, you're likely to try to get out of harm's way, and if you fail the sidestep, all you're going to do is just dodge straight into an attack, and your iframes can't save you then. But sometimes you don't want to get out of harm's way. Sometimes you want to stand your ground, and that is where defending and deflecting come into play. Defending, as the name states, literally allows you to guard against enemy attacks. You simply have to hold the left trigger by default, and NieR will defend in what direction he's facing. Now, as I've just said, he'll defend in the direction he is facing, meaning that if a shade comes up to the side or behind you, you're not going to defend it, and you're going to face the full brunt of the attack, so that is something to keep in mind. Also, your defense can be broken if enemies hit you with a hard enough attack, specifically bosses. Sometimes you won't be able to defend, your guard will be broken, and you'll be thrown like a cheap ragdoll straight across the screen. But for those of you who are more confident in your skills, you can deflect or parry an enemy's attack by defending at the very last moment, just before an attack is about to hit you. If done correctly, the enemy will be flung back as you parry their attack away, allowing you to hit them with a follow-up attack, depending on whether you press the light melee or the heavy melee. NieR will go off into a fancy parry-specific animation, and it will do a nice chunk of damage, allowing you to balance out your risk with a reward. Next up, we come to a mechanic that I like to call the execution. Now, I'm not sure what the in-game name for this is, but essentially whenever you down an enemy, if you go up to their downed figure and press the circle button, or the B button by default I guess, NieR will go into a specific animation where he wails into the enemy as they are on the ground, essentially executing them. This does a substantial amount of damage, allowing you to pretty much one-shot a lot of the higher tier enemies with one execution, so it's a great skill to have in your repertoire. The issue, however, comes with getting enemies into a downed state. Now, there are a couple of ways that I usually do this. One is wailing on an enemy and then hitting them with a launcher and then allowing them to fall onto the ground. The other way is to simply parry an enemy and then not follow up with an attack. What will happen is the enemy will more often than not stumble and then fall, leaving them vulnerable for a few seconds. Moving on, we finally find ourselves at the magic section of the video. Spent all this time talking about melee attacks, and finally we come to magic. Now, in particular, I want to focus on the Dark Blast ability, the pea shooter essentially that you're given access to right at the start of the game when you first find Grimoire Vice. Whilst it doesn't do the best of damage, especially when compared to some of the other magic at your disposal, it's great for damage per second essentially. You can go about and do your melee attacks whilst holding down the Dark Blast button, and it will give you a nice buff to your damage per second. So you always want to get into the habit of, whilst you're doing your melee, also holding down the Dark Blast button. And whilst we're talking about the Dark Blast, I also want to talk about the damage buff the initial Dark Blast you put out gets. Whenever you go off and hold the button for a stream of Dark Blasts, the first one always does more damage. You can capitalize on this effect by, instead of holding down the button for a consecutive stream, mashing the button. Because at that point, every Dark Blast you mash out will technically be considered a first Dark Blast, if that makes sense. I'm making this sound more convoluted than it isn't, but just mash the button and you'll basically get more damage, if that makes sense. And that is pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in this video. NieR Replicant has a very strange tutorial system. It's exactly as it was in the original, in that specific tutorials will pop up at specific points in the game. They'll freeze the game, you'll be forced to look at them, and you're forced to take them into account essentially. But the majority of the tutorials on the game's mechanics and systems are locked behind random enemy encounters, which doesn't make any sense. Sometimes when you defeat enemies seemingly randomly, you'll get a little pop-up telling you that you've unlocked a random tutorial in the menu and that you should go and check it out. It's quite strange because it means that sometimes you can go through large swathes of the game not knowing specific mechanics are a thing. And let's be honest, I'm guilty of this myself. Whenever these things pop up telling me I've unlocked another tutorial, I don't go and check it, because either I can't be bothered, I'd rather play the game as opposed to read random sentences, or I sometimes forget to. So yeah, peculiar way to put a tutorial, but then again, NieR Replicant is a very peculiar game. But that does bring us to the end of the video. Let me know down in the comments below if there's anything I've missed or anything else that you want me to cover. No doubt there probably is something I've missed. That's always how these sorts of videos go. Of course, if you enjoyed today's video, do be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing, as there is more NieR content on the way. And with all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I would like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.